to be very passionate about the issue of patriotism, the love of our country, and we invite people who makes a difference and meaningful impact to the lives of our people, both with regard to issues of concepts and the practical activity and so on. And once again, welcome to our podcast today as we are hosting Mbeki Mohale, Prof. Thank you very much and welcome, Mbeki Mohale. Ha re lebohe ke a nagana gore ba bangata ba tla botsa ba re a na Mbeki Mohale ke mang, o ka re Mbeki Mohale ke mang?
Nna he ke Mokwena wa Mokotedi.
Yeah.
Ke mogoditswana o mogolo Sekgosha ka Mpafatshe.
Hey.
O thukwena e jarile lehlabathe ka mokoko.
Hey.
Ke ile ka tswalwa ke ntate Ledinkakae wa Mohale, a tswa kgutlong sa Madaba Mohale ka hara naha. E se bitswa Mohale Suku. Mme ke Letebele. O na itswela Leratswana ka Linton. Ya ba ntate o tla Gauteng mo o rotla Metibong. Ya ba o sa chipa e ba le chipa la Gauteng.
Mbeki Mohale ko kenela hano wa bona lona ha le tiba haholo le kenela haholo Sotho. I'm sure that we want to cater for the Sothos like Bokabelo. They are Sotho, but they are not that their depth of Sotho. So skati ba haholo.
O no batla ke bue ka Sejakane.
Whatever that makes you comfortable.
Ke lona lebaka le ntseng hore naha e tsamaye, and I want to start there. So yesterday I was driving to a special board meeting. I hear a good friend of mine who's also a comrade. So I'll call him Chief M from KwaZulu-Natal. And they were talking about how do you start talking to your own children about sex? And when do you start doing that? To cut a long story short, he ends up by saying, I have decided as chief that I'll wait for my sons and my daughters to be fluent in English so that when they can converse, I can then talk to them about sex. The thought that crossed my mind was, what did our forebears do before the white men came to this country?
Absolutely.
Because these sexual organs have their own names in Sesotho. Now we have to name them in English so that we feel more relevant. But what about our own self-determination as a people? Because if you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything. Lastly, what about the 87% of the population in the 9 provinces that have no access to English as a medium of instruction?
Absolutely.
How then would you talk to them as your sons and daughters about when to have sex if the defining concept and language is English? And I end in my own mind by saying, that's why as a people we are so lost, because we have now reached a stage where we equate education and being educated with English. We equate clever with how articulate people are able to express themselves in a foreign language.
In fact, what you are saying, I remember there was somebody who said, the danger that we do to our kids in their formative stage, and then we get shocked and surprised when whatever values that they espouse are contrary to our values, African values. But
and not only that, we listen to these teachers saying, your child is not fluent in English like the other kids, because the standard is the white kids. Therefore, we suggest to bring her or him up, speak to him or her in English at home.
Okay.
And yet, the Muslims and the Jewish people actually pay extra money for private tuition for their own children to learn in Arabic and Hebrew, because that defines who they are. Let me just end by saying, I think I'll have a problem when I walk into my daughter's bedroom and I find her dreaming in English.
Who tries? Thank you very much. Tate Mohale.
Sebaka.
Yeah. Ne re batla ho tseba, I'm sure that ba bangata abaningi bafuna ukwazi ukuthi uNtate Mohale uzalelwe kuphi. What is it that defines you? What makes you tick? Who are you? What makes you tick?
Born in Benoni, but at that time I didn't know Charlize Theron. The family forcibly removed from KwaDugatole, where we lived in harmony with Chinese, Indian, Jewish people, etc., because of forced removals. For them to create a modern-day Rainsworth, which is now an Indian township. Across the railway line, they subsequently built Etwa, when that was originally where we came from, like Sophiatown, which is now Triumph, like District 6 in the Western Cape. Therefore, giving effect to the 1913 Land Act as the 10th land expropriation without compensation, but against African people. So all my life, when I was 6, I was already here in Katlehong. I went to school here, lower primary, high primary, and high school. That's where I met my lifelong friend and partner, Susan Mhlomo Unjomane. What defines me? The people who know me, when they speak about me, whether I'm there or not, they use 3 words. They say, I'm an activist, a defender of democracy, a social justice activist, to be precise. And what really keeps me awake at night is being unsettled about the fact that 30 years into democracy, poverty still has primarily a black and feminine face. And let me end about what really gives me nightmares. That if wealth is the inevitable outcome of both hard work and enterprise, then every woman in Africa should be a dollar billionaire. That is gas.
You know, I see when you do these sessions, there's a category that deals with a person, then you would get into that category. But also about this, what makes you up at night, you know, these political issues or things around our country and so on. In terms of your, if we were to talk about Ntate Mohale, you know, your progression, progress in life as a person, you know, and so on. What would you say, the role that you have played in society, that you believe in ensuring that the very same values you are, that you espouse and that you are talking about or articulating, you know, you see them through in society? What would you say?
You'll see that I'm being very deliberate about talking about me, myself, I, because I believe that people can Google. Therefore, I would rather spend more time on talking about our people and our country. So like most young people, when I was young, I looked around Katlehong. The people that lived in the biggest houses, Inele Bontate Ngaka, Mzamani, Bontate Pali, and then later on, other people who were our colleagues then went into that. So I went to Wits at that time, 1981, and Philip Tobias was our dean of the Wits Medical School. But he was also a world-renowned anthropologist, a very unusual combination, like an engineer who then becomes a chartered accountant. He asked me, why do you want to study medicine? And I said to him, I want to do a course that in the shortest period of time will give me the most amount of money so that I can be better able to look after my mother. He looked me in the centerpiece of the pupils of my eye and he says, you are in. Because I listened to a lot of misery stories, why people want to study medicine, alleviate pain and suffering, and help mankind. You told me the truth, you are in. That's how I got in. But very quickly, because, and it dawned to me that quickly, because when I went to Wits, it was classified a white university. Therefore, you needed a special ministerial consent to go to Wits. 27 of us applied to the Minister of Interior at that time, because of Group Errors Act, they actually couldn't house us on campus. But they housed us at Glen Thomas House inside the modern-day Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. So we wasted 2 hours a day, every day, even though we were already disadvantaged. 1 hour going, 1 hour coming back. The ministerial consent came on the 27th of April, 1981. University started in January. The significance to me was they loaded on your student card your meal allowance, which means I couldn't go to the dining hall and eat. But also this student card allowed you to borrow books from the library. Therefore, I couldn't. Of the 27 of us, 11 only were granted permission to study at Wits. The others were denied. Out of interest, I then went, Botulani, Zulu, to say, why were you denied entry? They had better grades than us. They were much more cleverer and hardworking. The notion of injustice became pronounced for me. Even though I was an activist at that time, 1976, we threw stones. We were active already in the student movement. Lebontate Temba Maseko, the late Diego Mosenek at that time. But at that time, for me, it became real. Therefore, I decided that I was going to be the reason why this does not happen again. And the words that ring loudly, even in my ear today, it's those of Mikhail Gorbachev, who gave us perestroika and glasnost. That allowed the Iron Curtain to go up and the wall to come down. When he said, we knew that the party was over, when all we could brag about is our history. And I dreamt that our wonderful movement, glorious movement, would never find itself in that position. That point was to be accentuated later on by Joshua Nkomo of ZAPU, when he said, the one thing that came very late in my life is that it is possible for a nation to attain its political liberation without its people being free. I combine those two and I say, I didn't think, even for a moment, that 30 years into democracy, we'd be looking around and seeing the self-perpetuating vicious cycle of abject poverty when we had the means to have reversed that.
Mbeki Mohale, thank you very much. The reason why we are normally, when we ask people, for example, to introduce themselves, so that gradually we would get into, but I realize that we have hit the road running with regard to all of these political issues, socio-political and so on. Coming to the issue, if I may, coming to the issue of a business where you are, and you are mentioned among the people who have actually achieved something, and the role players, role models, and so on. But there's also a notion that majority of our people, like Mbeki Mohale, are stooges of capital. How true that is?
Absolutely true. Absolutely true. Because you see, the English expression that says, he that pays the piper calls the tune, cannot be underestimated. And that's why we need to be said today, when borrowed converses pour from our lips, but also borrowed ropes hang from our necks. I have always been an activist in my whole life. I spent 33 years on the board of the Black Management Forum because we wanted to achieve two things. First, this notion of the development of managerial leadership. Secondly, because we wanted thought leadership, because we realized early on that if we don't think for ourselves, we place our future in the hands of others. It is up to us to create our own new world. But very soon, it dawns on you to say, in a four-roomed house, your parents are poor, so you have to go to town to ask somebody else for a job. And as long as you are getting a pay from that person, you are very mindful about what you say, not necessarily about what you think. But God forbid, when you start doing the bidding for them, when you start speaking like them. So very quickly, I then got an opportunity when I took an early retirement from Shell Oil Products Africa, because I had run 5 multinationals, all of them profitable, by the way. 2 years into democracy, 1996, I had the opportunity to run the world's biggest and oldest elevator company, Otis.
Otis,
Marshall
yes.
Street in downtown Joburg.
Uh-huh.
Not Otis, South Africa. Otis, Africa, responsible for 33 of the then 53, now 55 African countries. But it became very clear to me that, you know, if business can be transformed, South Africa will be transformed. For the simple fact that at that time, when I took an early retirement at age 55, having run Otis, Shell Oil Products Africa, spent 12 years in pharmaceuticals because I studied medicine at Wits, is the fact that we really need to build our own businesses and hire our own children. Because it is madness to continue to make babies and send them to a different neighborhood for them to go down on their knees and ask somebody else for a job, because then we'll not really be truly free. So when I took an early retirement at age 55, these 89 CEOs of the top 100 companies listed on the GSE then asked me to come and be their boss as the CEO of Business Leadership South Africa, an organization that started as SA Foundation for two reasons and two reasons only: defend apartheid and sanction busting. I scratched my head and say, as an activist, how do I do this? And the answer came very quickly to say, it would be wonderful to go there, because if you agree that the objective is transformation, imagine eating the beast from inside out. And I was very clear about what we're going to do. So I spent 24 months there doing exactly that. At that time, in fact, BLSA itself was transformed. Let me just end by saying, I remember it was Monday, the 3rd of July, 2017. I rather found 7 people on the executive at that time of July. 1st of November, that executive of 7 with 1 white woman was an executive of 5, all of them black, 3 of them women, only 2 were men, if I include myself. And that's really what we wanted to do. And we achieved that by going back to these 89 CEOs and say, let's agree the strategy. Even today, I still remember it, because it hung only on 3 pillars. Number 1 was we wanted an intensive socio-economic growth, and transformation. Secondly, we said we wanted the protection of key state institutions. Lastly, we said we wanted to position business as a national asset. So honestly, you ask an important question, because all our working life, we have seen how many black people, women and men of stature, of character, wholesomeness, have been reduced into nothing.
Absolutely.
Because of greed, because of money, because they were worried about their bond and about private education for their own children. They wouldn't even say boo to a goose, docile, conforming creatures. We are blessed that we still have the voice because of Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, who made us free, where you can look at a sitting president and say, Mr. President, you are a thief. Go back to bed that night knowing you'll wake up at home. That's what we celebrate more than anything else. And that's why business itself is the one that actually introduced this notion of bribery, stealing, and cheating to some of our activists who came in exiles, and they didn't know anything about anything, but they themselves were courted by business to say, we want this policy, change this decision, and for that, maybe you might get 10 rand, and 10 rand became 10 million. And that's how it was introduced. Today we speak about corruptor and corruptee, but we know that at the heart of it, business has always been driven by profits. That's what motivated me to be an activist, to say it's about time that business itself is steered back. And what is needed is really incisive, decisive leadership, which only business itself can provide.
You know, you said something. In fact, it's very rare where you'd say to a person, because when you say to a person, people regard you as a stooge, you know. people tend to become very defensive and what have you. But you know, how you explained the matter is very interesting. But let me follow up by saying we might have discussions more at this level and so on. But we always say, whatever discussion at whatever level, we measure the progress of that with the impact it has, positive impact it has on the ground. If you look at your participation in business and so on, with all the policies that you had in mind, the principles that you espoused and so on, the difference that you have made, if you are to look back with hindsight and say, we have made a contribution in this regard, what would you say to us?
So the first, there are many and varied as part of the collective. We were the first organization as the PMF in our conference in Spear in Cape Town, having agitated for affirmative action, to say we want an affirmative action act of parliament. We then asked at that time Cyril Ramaposa to chair it, and it later got known as the Ramaposa Commission that came up with this notion of 21%, 35%, and 51% black ownership, where 51 is a black owned company, 35 is a black controlled, 21 is a black influenced company. We had the law. When the first Minister of Labour was appointed in the Department of Labour at that time, before we changed it, Tito Mboweni, we gave him 16 comrades in one day to go and man his office, because we thought that's where the nub of transformation sits. Amongst them, Bontate Mpomakwana, who wrote 60% of what was then called the affirmative action legislation, which Minister Tito Mboweni said, but let's focus on the end in mind. We called it employment equity legislation. Out of it, the Employment Equity Commission. When Mpomakwana left, we then went and got Dr. Loiso Babane to complete the 40% of the work that remained. And we've been manning government departments ever since. Even today, that's what we're still doing. To fast forward, even this red tape czar, Ntatisi Ponkosi, was suggested by us as business to say, go and unlock some of the things that does not make it easy for our people to start their own businesses. Ntate Daniel Minele, who had to look after the 8.5 billion that was donated to us by the European Union at that time for climate change, for just energy transition, with its problems, nominated by us. And I can go on. But really, in the final analysis, is what have you personally done? I can say without any equivocation, fear of reprisals or retribution, that where I've been finally accountable, I've always left another black person. At Otis Elevators, 1998 as an MD, I left a black person as the CEO, Segran Reddy. My own executive assistant, Carol Hunt, ended up being a supervisor and on the EXCO. Fast forward quickly to when I went to Shell Oil Products Africa. There I left Ntate Hloniphiso Justice Mdolo as the chairman of the board and the general manager of our retail business, which was 60% of our business. But Methabile Mulukume was head of legal. Bridget Naidu was head of human capital. Me, who was really looking after the finances, Barbara Makubedu, the CFO at that time from Bushbuckridge, went on to be our CFO, but also to run the Netherlands operations in The Hague, or The Hague as the Dutch call it. When I came to BLSA, I left Ndate Themba Maseko there, who came from GCIS at that time. Because he was a whistleblower, we didn't want him to be the one that suffers openly, and it sends a message that says, if you blow the whistle, the 10,000 people that work in local government would keep their mouth shut, and we gave him a job precisely to puncture that inflated fallacy. The person that I left there as my successor, I headhunted from the PMF, Mebusiswe Mavros. Here's the last one, just to be short. When I had the opportunity to chair the Bidvest Group Limited, a proudly South African company, formed here by Brian Joffe, now employs 128,000 people, 7 divisions, has 350 companies. One of the first tasks I did was to ask Lindsay Ralph to think about his legacy. Won't it be wonderful if he left an African woman? He left us Methembekile Nompumelelo, Madisa, who is the group CEO of the Bidvest Group, this conglomerate of a South African company. In just 2 years, what she did, of course, the results were better than pre-COVID. Her 2022 results, the first CEO ever to declare the biggest dividend in the history of this 38-year-old company. And the first one to breach the 100 billion rand turnover mark in 2022 at 114.7 billion rands and 11.4 billion trading profit. It's a listed company, so people are free to go and Google it. But here's the nub. She does this with a board where she was the only woman on that board that is 80% black and 73% African women.
Ndari, thanks. You know, I'm trying, as you are explaining all of these things, I'm trying to reconcile all of these. For example, the good things done, your exposure, the contribution, and so on. But I want to reconcile that. Since 30 years into our democracy, in fact, lives of our people have actually gone south. Rate of unemployment, strategic assets of our government, and all of that gone down. You know, so I'm trying to look at the positivity you are projecting now with all of these, nice, which is good. But I'm saying, what is the barometer to measure success, progress, or success, given the lives of the people today, rate of unemployment gone up, and all of these? Seemingly the center is not holding. How would you reconcile that for our viewers?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, and that's where the sadness comes in. Because the only measure should be, are our people better off today
than they were
during apartheid? And unfortunately not. And it starts with the houses in Soweto, in Orlando East and West, 4-roomed houses that were built by people who didn't like us. They're still standing.
Yeah.
The ones we built under our first economic program, the reconstruction and development program, are disintegrating and falling apart. Why? And when, in hindsight, we look back at 30 years of democracy, we have to admit to ourselves that actually our leaders fell victim to greed. Instead of common purpose, greater good, they started thinking about me, myself, I. Instead of accepting and having a profound appreciation that leadership is a privilege to improve the quality of lives of others, not an opportunity to enrich self, they chose self. When there was a conflict between personal interest or to serve, they chose personal interest. And that's because of that. So when you look at the first 10 years, we did some amazing, wonderful, good things. We walked into the multilateral institutions, IMF, World Bank, UN, and you'll see the South Africans are here. The rest of the continent was saying, we want to be like this South Africa, because we've been let down by some of our leaders. The last 15 years, the drop has been absolutely precipitous. We had the best president in the world, a convict, Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela, who went on arguably to become the best president in the world, handed over seamlessly to Thabo Mbeki at that time, something that was unheard of in the world, not just in Africa. Thabo Mbeki went on to give us 43 consecutive quarters of positive GDP growth. It culminated in October of the financial crisis 2007 with 5.6% GDP growth. Since then, we've never touched that. He was to be unceremoniously recalled from Polokwane, and ever since then, it has been down. Now we hold the world record for all the wrong reasons. And let me just end by saying, number one, we have the highest cash in transit, highest in the world. We took over from Brazil. A quarter we do more than they do the whole year. The highest unemployment rate in the world. Even with a narrow definition, Stats SA says 32.9%. That's north of 40% on an expanded definition. But the most unequal society in the world, Gini coefficient of 0.63. Even there, we're measuring only income inequality, not wealth inequality, not asset inequality. Because if we did, I swear to God, there'll be a revolution in this country. But we are also the country with the highest SME failure rate in the world. Lastly, we are second only to Russia in terms of suicide rate in the world. I was going to throw in the fact that we've got the highest GBVF rate in the world, not by a factor of 2, but 5 times the global average. At the heart of it, greed. Because South Africa, like Africa, is not a poor country or continent, just poorly managed.
Yeah, Ndate Mohale, you know, I'm not an economist or a number cruncher. You know, for example, when we measure or look at the performance of previous presidents, all of them, Nelson Mandela with his programs, then Thabo Mbeki, TM, and. Now, you know, economists would say, yes, we realized growth, but growth with no employment creation and expansion. And people would say, for example, take SAA. SAA, Coleman Andrews came in the SAA, you know, took the assets of the state, sold them, and contributed to the balance sheet and say we made profit, whereas you are basically disposing assets of the state and you then declare that as profit. Now, Thabo can actually be seen as a person who has done good, economically speaking, but terribly bad in terms of employment creation. What does that mean? It means if we boast about the performance of a country, economically and so on, that must actually translate to the betterment of a life of an ordinary person, citizen on the ground. But yes, we might talk about a good balance sheet, but the people are suffering. One last thing I want also, Saratute, you know, I remember when we moved from Reconstruction and Development Program and we went to GEAR and all of that. And I remember my friends were in the local government and people were mothballing, you know, power stations. And my argument was the Reconstruction and Development Program, in terms of its statistical analysis, when ESCOM was providing such number, servicing such number, now the number has expanded, but you are closing down electricities, whereas contrary, it should say you need to increase capacity for you to be able to. What would be your analysis on that?
Sure. I couldn't agree with you on everything that you have said. I wanted to disagree, but I can't. So the first one is, let's look at Thabo Mbeki's performance. And you're correct, we even economically called it jobless growth. GDP grew, but what actually happened is that when the GDP grows by, say, 5.6%, which it did, you expect the jobs to grow commensurate to that growth. It didn't. We still had job growth, but far less than the GDP growth, hence jobless growth. So TM needs to be credited for giving us some positive numbers of people that were employed, far too less compared to the potential. Fact. The second one that you raise is the issue of SAA and its performance, and the third is of ESCOM. So at SAA, fortunately, I was the first black executive vice president at SAA, and I say that with no pride, because there's nothing that embarrasses me than when you have an opportunity as an African to occupy spaces that your own people ordinarily don't. You really only have 2 choices. Either you continue to be celebrated as the only and first, or you consciously, deliberately, purposefully kick down the doors to bring in people that look like you. In that dilemma, I'll always choose kicking down the doors. So I worked with Coleman Andrews, and yes, he sold the assets of the companies to declare them as profits. By the way, that's how business works. So he did absolutely nothing wrong. When you come and run a factory of cars and you find that you've got spare engines for each and every solitary one of the cars, the cost of holding that stock is 30%. If you sell at least 1 engine each, you get the money, you still have 1 engine left, so that in emergency you can reduce it. You reduce your cost of holding stock. That's what is called business. That's what we are taught at business school. But that wasn't the sin of Coleman Andrews. Here it demonstrated our own stupidity as Africans.
In fact, that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Normally, just to Hanu. Normally we say that when we have an asset, the asset utilization, the value that we derive from an asset, depending on the percent that we get, either we're running at a loss or making profit. And I'm saying Coleman Andrews selling all of the assets, but we go back round about 10, we hire the same things that we owned, we did not owe.
So here I can talk authoritatively because I worked with him as an executive vice president. When the CFO was Andre Viljoen at that time.
Yes.
So what he did, he taught us this notion called revenue management. How to take an aircraft to the right destination with the right capacity and charge for it. I looked after three things. I looked after global sales. I looked after revenue management. That became my job. Where somebody can sit here, they paid 3,000. This one sits next to you, they paid 2,000 because of the timing in which they bought those tickets. He taught us that because he came from American Airlines. And lastly, it was about strategic alliances. When you look at the signatures on those, they'll have my signature, including the route to OR Tambo, to Perth, and then to New Zealand. We made it a direct flight. We saved 11 million rand a day. It has my signature because we're doing code share and commercial agreements. We flew to 700 destinations at that time. But where it demonstrated our stupidity is that in exile we had learned that most post-activists, when they're in government, they make money only when three things really happen. When they buy crude, when they buy aeroplanes, and when they buy arms. That's when an opportunity to steal, to loot arises. So an opportunity arose for us to restock our fleet. At that time, we're using Boeing 747-400s, which are American. And some of our politicians had already spoken to the Europeans, Airbus, to sell them the aeroplanes, where if the numbers are big, the 500 million can stay offshore in somebody's private account. And they wanted to push this. We are the executives running this. And we didn't have sight of this. It only became clear to us. In doing that, here's Coleman Andrews, who's the American, looks at this and he says, one of the ways you reduce your costs is to make sure that all your pilots run the same type of aircraft. So that if this one doesn't come to work, for whatever reason, this one can stand in because they don't need extra conversion courses, training, because it's the same fleet. It's cheaper to run. So we already had Boeings. He said, we can go to the Americans and buy cheaper, especially those that were ordered by the Malaysian Airways, and they fell into difficulties, and we could get them at $20 million cheaper. At that time, our leaders were looking at something else. They wanted something else. And they saw Coleman being an obstacle, and they wanted to get rid of him at all costs. Minister Jeff Radebe was the Minister of Public Enterprises at that time. They were so eager to get rid of him, they didn't know what to do. They just wanted to say, you are fired after 2 years of his 4-year contract. And then after 2 years, they say, no, you can go. Coleman realized that, you know what, it's their country, I can't do much. He said, no, I'll go, but you have to pay me. They said, okay, we'll pay you until the end of the year. He said, okay. He signed on the dotted line, he gave it back to them. And he said, oh, by the way, I had shares in this company, phantom shares that were given to all our employees.
Yeah.
Because we did not know at that time. Because remember, we are not business people. We are fighters. So we had given share options to all our people, including Coleman Andrews. It has a strike rate of, say, 3 rand. It has a vesting period of 3 years. The theory is that maybe at that time it will be 6. You sell your options at 6. You pay back the company the 3 that it sold you to you for. Then you pocket the 3. That's called profit. That's what happened. So Coleman then says, no, but I've got these share options. In our eagerness to get rid of him, we then say, how much are your share options? He says to them, the offer, the strike rate was 140 million rand. You have to sell it maybe at 200, minus the 140, you make the profit of 60. When he mentioned 140, the minister at that time was so eager to get rid of him. He says, you said how much? He said 140. He wrote a check of 330 million of his salary, of his bonus, part of his shares all combined to get rid of him without even knowing this small arithmetic. This is not mathematics. That it is 3, sell at 6, you still have to pay the 3. He paid nothing, and then he left. That is our own stupidity, and I include myself in that. Therefore, you can't blame the poor man for being commercially astute, having taught us revenue management, for selling the assets because they were costing us in the warehouses sitting there where some of our people were stealing it. Everything that he did with his arrogance, and I hold no brief for him, but my grandmother, as I end, says, facts you can't deny, but truth you can apply.
Thank you very much. Tate Mohale, I think it's invigorating, you know. But I want to go to, you know, these things of business and politics, they go concurrently. Given the experiences that we've learned in the past, how we performed, you know, on the business front, those who were fortunate to be deployed in strategic areas of our economy and so on. If you look at that, have we learned anything? If you take into account our 30 years of experience and the disaster that follows us in these 30 years, within the political context of the current juncture, what would you say?
Sure. So first, Harriet says, I have freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if they knew that they were slaves. So we get an opportunity to get into business. Our primary objectives must be, we want to change the structure of this economy so that it looks like us. Because in business, the system succeeds, not the individual. And why is this important? Because you want to get into business and say, we want it to be easy for our own people to own these businesses. Like Brian Joffe when he started the Bidvest Group with 7 million rand loan from Investec by Stephen Kosef. Do we have the Stephen Kosefs that can believe in you when you start your company? You say, here's the money, 7 million, go and buy that. Oh, by the way, once you have done that, go and look for other companies. We will give you a war chest of money to go and buy others and bring them to us to do a due diligence. Because that's what we do. We are a bank. And by the way, because we are here, we know the good ones and the not so good. Imagine starting a business with a war chest. I've met many black people who've got brilliant, sellable ideas. But they took those ideas to the grave because nobody wanted to finance them, because nobody believed in them. Now we get in as an opportunity to work in these businesses, to be the first beneficiaries. We forget the dream on top of the mountain to change the system. What about the system did we want to change? We wanted to change the fact that when the British had a dilemma to leave South Africa to the black elite, who were more educated and were better farmers than the Afrikaners, they went to a corner and said, but who are we and what we stand for? They said, what we want from South Africa, number one, is a crucible of cheap labor forever. Number two, we want these blacks to risk their lives to go to the bottom of the belly of the earth to dig for this gold. We will have the first right of refusal. Lastly, they said, if they dig the diamonds, the most valuable precious metals at that time, we will determine the price. And they created the London Sales Organization. 30 years into democracy, that structure of cheap labor, giving them the first right of refusal, and we risk it all only for somebody to give us a price, determine the price. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the world except with us Africans. We don't see anything wrong with it. We haven't changed it. That's why when we get in, we were so eager to get in that we kicked the ladder so that there are fewer blacks that are there. The people that came in as BE partners, they found other blacks who are already BE partners because of their political connections. Who are these guys? What have they done? No, in fact, kick them out, replace them with us. Instead of saying we need more like these, they started replacing relevant blacks with so-called irrelevant blacks. We started an internecine strife, fighting amongst ourselves, rather than increasing this pie to be a bigger pizza of which every one of us would have a slice.
A bigger slice.
We absolutely forgot. So we started fighting about the raisin when we could have had a slice of a lemon and all of us would have been happier. That was at the crux of it. So now, even the people who didn't like us started seeing an opportunity and say, oh, when they do this, you know what, let's continue making profits, let's continue excluding them. That's why 30 years into democracy, Tabia Kabinde, on the 20th anniversary of the Employment Equity Commission, which she chaired, says black representation in positions of leadership has graduated from 14.3% to 14.7%. If you do the math, it will take us 150 years for this economy to be broadly reflective of the demographics. It's not sustainable, as I end, that 8.3% of white people still occupy 67% of the C-suite. It's not sustainable that the top 10% of the population owns 80% of the wealth. Because what we learned from our forebears is that when they went to the negotiation table in CODESA 1, which collapsed, then CODESA 2, they came there not looking at what they can take out of that table. They came prepared to give up something. What are we prepared to give up so that black people in general prosper and have a better quality of life, not just for the elected few?
Ndade Mohale, given our experience once more with all what we've just articulated, are we better positioned, are we better placed now vis-a-vis GNU that has just come, Government of National Unity currently as we stand, with its current composition?
I think it's a sad state of affairs. Because the notion of a government of national unity, we invented it as a country that was just free. 27th of April, which then became 28th and 29th, 1994, we voted. 10th of May, we inaugurate the president. We decide on 2 deputy presidents for reconciliation. The ANC got a 63% majority. But there was an existential crisis. Some of the airports were bombed at that time. There was an army organized by RVBA. Constant Viljoen was the commander. They were saying, tell us when the guns are here at home. Mandela wanted to achieve reconciliation. For reconciliation, because of an existential crisis, I repeat, formed the Government of National Unity. This then increased to 72.9% during Thabo Mbeki's time. We could have changed the constitution if we wanted to at that time, which Mandela had signed into law 2 years after elections in 1996. But we chose not to because of reconciliation. So what has happened with these elections? We now realize that, no, the electorate is not so stupid after all. They humiliated our once glorious movement. From 57% nationally to 40%. Now we need to go to our former colonizers and ask for their permission to create a government. So there is no existential crisis. There's a crisis in the ANC, not in the country. Why are we letting the crisis in the ANC to become a country crisis? So instead of just forming a coalition, we decide to call it a Government of National Unity. This is where the pain comes. The ANC got 40%. But MK Party got 15%. Between the two of them, which is Isaac and Ishmael, same father, same mother, they got 55%. They could have ruled, just those two. If you want to look around and say, who else is part of us? You get the EFF, which was 11%. They are now 9%. You've got 64%. But when the crux comes, what has come to us to go to our former colonizers first when we actually have black parties, not black parties, but that are members, offshoots of the same ANC, ideologically the same. Freedom Charter, all comply to. And we want the same thing for our people. So what has gotten over us to now include the people that we know. We are so far off ideologically. We don't want the same things. They oppose every progressive labor law in this country. And we say, no, we're going to ask for your permission. Now, in hindsight, you can see actually who is running. A 20% party is calling the shot because they thought about it, they wrote the framework, and they presented it immediately after the elections. And we are still negotiating with them. We didn't have our own. And also, even in Gauteng has postponed the announcement of the elections twice because they haven't reached an agreement with one party, the DA. The DA held us up nationally. The DA is holding us up in Gauteng. And yet there are 11 parties in the national government. There are more parties in the province of Gauteng. But who do we defer to? Because white people are used to being bosses, because they expect black people to be gardeners and helpers. That's their only interaction with black people. They continue to call the shots. But the majority of our people don't know that they are slaves. Had they known, they would have also been released. Let me end with the hounding words that Mandela said. He said, you don't negotiate with like-minded people. You negotiate with your enemy. So if Jacob Zuma is the enemy, but there are more things in MK Party and the ANC in common than there are with the DA. And our first default is to go to the DA. I think we are going to be remembered as the first African country that became free from colonialism. After 30 years, we handed over power to the former colonizers. The same way that we are the only country in Africa that became free from colonialism, and we didn't substantially increase the quality of education, and we didn't change the ownership by the indigenous people by at least double digits.
Tata Mohale, I must tell my, co-producers here that, we had a guest and he paralyzed me somehow because there were certain questions. My thought process, my mind is that we were going to answer in a particular way. But thank you very much. And it's humbling, clarifying, because I normally say in our quest in this, what we have established, we are driven by a desire to contribute in whatever form possible to ensure that we contribute towards a direction where the betterment of our country and our people is seen. So that is why we call all kinds of people. The last time we had the Afrikaner community, we're engaging them and so on, because we want to see this harmonization of relations among national groups within South Africa and so on. Not only do we call people that we agree with, but we also call people whom we believe that they are also equally South Africans and they would contribute. We might have our own stereotypes and so on, but we'll help each other along for the good of South Africa as a country and so on. Tata Mohale, hopping on to the situation of the politics and so on, here are parties before the formation of a government of national unity. And majority of parties are saying, no, we're disputing the outcomes. For the interest of the country and its stability and so on, do you believe that the management of the dispute as reported by the aggrieved parties dealt with, adequately and so on? What would be your view on that?
So before I go to the IEC and the management of the dispute, you said something very profound, that we invite even those that we don't agree with. One of the fundamental things that we can learn about business is that in the 30 years of our democracy, the people that really benefited is the Afrikaners, the Muslims, and the Jews. Therefore, so that we don't reinvent the wheel, we need to learn the secrets of why are they so embarrassingly successful in business. Because your formed businesses, some of them have tanked. Some of them are the ones that I myself have started. 7, 3 are still alive. I own them 100% with my family, but we are struggling with trading wood. And they've got 10 secrets, and I'll share just 3 with you in the interest of time. 1, they ask the question, do you as a family and as a community regularly sit around the table and talk about how to make money? 2, do you, as a family and as a community, sit around the table and talk about how you are going to buy from each other and one another? Lastly, do you as a family and as a community regularly invest in and refer business to each other and one another? That is all. There is no rocket science. That's how business is done. As 90% of the population that is black in this country, if we supported each other's businesses, there is no reason why any of us should go to bed hungry. The management of the IEC. You see, in disputes, most people will raise a dispute, factually or not. What you want to do if you are an effective and efficient leader is to give them space for them to articulate it, so that at the end they can say, I was heard, I felt needed and wanted. Even if you don't agree with them, you share with them the dispassionate facts and you do it with respect, not with preconceived ideas. That's what we want as human beings. When I come to you and say, I have reason to believe ABCD, first I must feel that you're taking me serious. Number 2, that I was listened to. Thirdly, that I was treated with respect. That's all. Because some of the fundamental values that we hold dear, even in our own wonderful movement, is that of honesty, of integrity and respect. I must catch you stealing from me red-handed and fire you on the spot, having followed due process. As you pack your paraphernalia to say, oh, I did something I wasn't supposed to do. It is in the employee booklet. I've lost my job. I don't know where my income is going to come from. But damn it, Bonang treated me with respect. If we did that, I think half of our disputes would be dealt with properly. You don't dismiss people just because you don't agree with them. You don't dismiss people because you don't understand where they're coming from. You don't dismiss people publicly without first discussing with them privately. In leadership, we say, that's why you palette, highlight, and celebrate publicly. You stand on rooftops, but you chastise in private. It's called stakeholder management. It's called EQ. It's called human decency. So if MK had lodged a complaint, you want to process it like you process others. You want to thank them for having brought them to your attention. You want to go and investigate and come up with the facts and say, that's what you raised. These are the facts. And somebody says, you know what? Now I see where you're coming from. You don't have to agree, but I see where you're coming from because I also see where you're coming from. Let me end by saying, just because I'm right does not make you wrong. And if my leadership can be challenged, that makes me a questionable leader. Those are fundamental principles that if we led by, we'll be more humble and much kinder.
Mbeki Mohale, 2 questions from me. Last question. The first one I'm going to ask, the viewers will pardon me and my colleagues. We are all groomed, shaped by what you constantly refer to as the glorious movement with a noble cause. All of us. I joined when I was very young, but I found myself, I want your opinion, I found myself referring to the African National Congress as a vacillating body, that derives its mandate from Africans. It espouses Eurocentric values, but rejected by whites. What's your view on that?
Ntateskas, you really don't give me an opportunity to disagree with you, and how I'm desperate to disagree with you. And here again, I have to agree with you because our once glorious movement, there is no doubt that it has lost its way. You see, if you don't know what you stand for, you'll fall for anything. Alice in Wonderland says, if you don't know where you are going, every road will take you there. We define ourselves, even in confused terms. We say we're a broad church. Broad church means anything and everything. I think our wonderful movement is the longest liberation movement in the continent because it has a self-selection process. When you joined the ANC in exile, you could pay the supreme price. You could be arrested, you could be tortured. Your whole family could be incarcerated.
Absolutely.
Therefore, only the most diligent and dedicated of warriors said, I'm prepared to die for this. When we became free, careerists came. People now say, I see an opportunity to get out of my informal settlement in Alexander and wear a mayoral chain and drive in a motorcade, without understanding that the movement was to reclaim the self-worth, the respect of African people. So now it becomes about me, myself, I. That vacillation we saw when we first came into power, and we produced the best economic policy this country has ever seen, called the Reconstruction and Development Program. Today, when we say RDP, most people think it's a house.
Yes.
It had 6 fundamental principles. We didn't even allow it 3 years. 3 years we did it. We then changed it to the growth,
Economic,
economic and redistribution program.
Yeah.
Because we said we wanted a macro economic policy. RDP was microeconomic. That's where the vacillation started. Since then, it's been an alphabet soup. As Giza, the 9-point plan, the new reconstruction and development program. It has been a mess. Because again, the backbone is just not there. We didn't learn anything from the Jewish people experiences in Germany during the Holocaust. Even today, they are still steadfast, going after those people that subjected their people to that torture, to mayhem and death and incarceration. Today we are now told, no, we've been free for 30 years. Now we are free, we can retire these transformative instruments. We are now equal. We now need to look at merit as if there was no merit in our processes. But really, at the heart of it, it's also a demonstration that we were so eager to get into political office without thinking deeply and profoundly, what are we going to do with this power to change the system? It looks like all we fought for is to live like white people. Have a house in Sfako Makhatu, presidential guest house, or Mahlambandlovu in Pretoria. Have another house in the ministerial complex in Cape Town, and 6 months here and 6 months there, and drive with a motorcade of 10 cars. If you are deputy president, if you are the president, it doubles. That even our first 10 years of the State of the Nation address, we did at 7 in the evening. Only after, when we realized that we started with doing them at 2 when our people were at work. So who are we talking to? And we are still talking to them in English. And yet we know only 9% of the South Africans go to institutions of higher learning. We've increased that now to 11%. There's still almost 89% of our people that are comfortable in their own language. But we speak in English so that others hear us, but not the people whose message is designed to.
Is intended.
The same way that a dog chases a car without giving much thought to say, what if the car stops? And indeed, when the car stops, it scratches his head. What now? Now we have freedom and we don't know what to do with it. Therefore, I think it's a crisis of gigantic proportions that we haven't learned from other countries. There are 5 countries that were in a state worse than ours when we became free. Some of them are known globally today. South Korea, Singapore, Germany after the Second World War. Some of those countries received aid from Ghana and Zambia in 1960. But in 2010, the economies of these countries were 10 times bigger than those that gave them aid. But here's the lesson for me. In 20 years, these countries received aid. In 20 years, they were giving aid. 60 years after Africa has become free, African leaders are holding a conference about how to ask for better forms of aid rather than being self-sufficient.
Ntate Mohale, ke kope ho wena ke a qetelo ena potso. Re tla kopa se nako e nngwe re tlo ke re bue re kenyane melomo. Ke utlwe o bua ka hore o nyetse from 1981 and proudly so, you know, when you speak about that, you know, you ooze this positivity, this excitement. Can you tell us something about Honyala Wahao?
This is the greatest and the best decision I've ever made in my entire life. To get married to Miss Susan, Muradi wa Mhlong, Unjomani, Umkapi, Mbeki, wa lahleka iminyakanyaka watholakala ngosuku losine. Mbeki ngoba bhebhela umuntu ematsheni ngoba saba amazolo. Now tsibe miyantswala ngilidebele. Kimthimkhulu waphukani. And I look at her now and say, I was 17 and you said yes. What were you smoking? And she laughs. And today I'm blessed to be still with my original wife. Next month, on the 24th of August, we will be happily married for 43 glorious years. She's born with 2 daughters, both of them named after Bonang, my paternal great-grandmother, Nkgono Sirialong Tshepiso. The last born, ke Khorula, ke Nkgono Maneo wa Mpiti wa Sekake, named after my grandmother. Lenyalo ke pallo. And of all the things that we can possibly do, when you have the stability of somebody at home who corrects you when you speak, who believes in you, who encourages you, who smooths the rough edges, who also communicates that you are much more than what you have become, there is nothing that you can't accomplish. So I thank her, I palette, highlight, and celebrate the fact that because I had stability at home, I could achieve and move mountains in the workplace. And when the world is hostile and angry outside, I have my sanctuary, which is at home. When I open the gate, ke a tseba hore ke a lapeng. Ha ke qetelle ka hore nna ka nnete ke monna Mosotho, ke bonang fela ka seboko ke Mokwena. Ke Mokwena Mokotedi. Ke mokgoditse wa moholo Sekgosha ka Mpafatshe. Kwena jarile lehlabathe ka mokotlo. Thwe ya sesa Kwena, ya nyoloha bandiba, thalabodiba ya ithatika ka lebopo. Thwe ya raha leqhamu wa tsekema. Ra ba ra bona mpeng mmala o mosweu, mpeng tsa makola ha tetema. Ya lelala ya sheba hodimo, ra ba ra bona hodimo mahananeng, hona mo dulang teng Morena le Mina. Ke gagaulane molemo wa tshepe, ke rua la morampukana. Na ke bone ke banana, ke bona ke ditsha dikgolo fela. Ke mphatlalatsane na le diameso, re bone ka yona hore masiwa santse a sele. Ke lenesa la mma metsi matshwana, la mma metsi madididi, metsi a ka thewa thabeng a etsa diphororo. Banana ba sala ba o tla koma ka hlogo. Ke for peace. Kgaola dithota re bone, ho etsise mmao le ntatao, mohlang o le mohlatsatsi le leholo, mohla o no phaladiswa baloi, thoteng tsa modidi ba taoleng, ho thwe Mohale ha matha, wa lelala. Tsepa sela shebile hodimo, a yo kena ho baholo ba hae, baholo bo ntile morinywane, motse o sena Mohale wa hlora. Ke le ranthane la nthiti ya banana ba le pomme ba lahla fatshe, ba re le sale le tshikisa Mohale naha, ho tshika wa tshika Mokwena, ba sitwa kwa gamolala. Tshika jwalo ka Mankukune, tsietsa jwang haholo ke basadi, ba ntse ba mpotsa kgafetsa, Bonang ha ile kae, ha se ho le sebakanyana. ha se bohole ba o pala mapere le ba maoto ba ntse ba fihla ho dikoting ka ba ke le bontsha nka kgathala kwa ga monwana le hodimo mo ja wa romelwa nka ba ke romela ditlhare teng ke dilemo le ngwana mme a ntse a kula mahalo ha lefetseng ha kana kana ha ilale
Oh.
rena makwala re none e tswentwa ke ya madula mmoho ya kae baneng.
Awu sibonge ungafuna ukusivulisela ukushiwo njalo ngesizulu kuye kuthiwe umuntu umvusela madlingusi wabona rona serilidingaka jwale how di bitsa jwalo ufanele umuntu naye akakikize azisho makodwa kithi ngoba sila ku podcast we're not going to do that, but thank you very much. Nna ke setolo sa batlokwa ke setolo sa bagolo ke ba moloi mohla ba goka le mo ba isa moreneng ba re bona morena hlabi ke utswa ke nkgono ya tsena ke re wena re a leboha isikhathi esisitholile ukuthi uzoblessa le invitation namhlanje. Thank you very much. Colleagues, thank you very much. With this time, I think we've come to the end of our session. In our tour, we normally beam also our sessions. You find us on TikTok, on YouTube, and you find us on Twitter. Please follow us, the South African Agenda podcast. That's where we are, where you find us. But thank you very much for this session. Luena Moholwane, realebo.
Ngiyathembisa ukuthi ngizabuya impela kuthiwa ayisandla engalo yonke sendlula ikhanda amathanga ahlanzela abangenamabhodo. Ngiyabonga Nkosi.
Akubonga. Thank you.